Next.
I'll
Perfect.
go next, and I have some slides we'll cue up here briefly. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. My name is J.B. Hamby. I'm the Chair of the Colorado River Board of California and California's Colorado River Commissioner. Next slide. So as we've talked about today, the Colorado River encompasses 7 states in the United States and 2 in Mexico, Baja and Sonora. In the upper basin, you have Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, Utah. Lower basin is Arizona, California, Nevada. Secretary Crowfoot mentioned half of the Colorado River users in the basin and outside of it live here in California. Next slide. So the Colorado River Board was formed in 1937 to protect California's interests and rights in the Colorado River. It's composed of member agencies that are both urban and agricultural. We also have members from the Department of Water Resources and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And recently, and very historically, we have 2 at-large members that have been appointed by Governor Newsom, President of the Fort Yuma-Quechan Indian Tribe, Jordan Joaquin, and Frank Ruiz of the Audubon Society. Next slide. So each state has a representative on Colorado River matters. They can't represent all of the interests, but in order to comprehend all of the diverse stakeholders across the basin, each state has one appointed commissioner. For California, that's the chairman of the Colorado River Board, who serves ex officio as the commissioner. The basin state representatives, commissioners, meet periodically discussing conditions of the river, operations, future operating rules, and collaborate with the United States, Mexico, and basin tribes. Next slide. I want to give you a little overview and tour of some of our agencies that rely and communities that rely on Colorado River water. First is the Palo Verde Irrigation District, one of the first users on the lower Colorado River. They have 105,000 acres of forage, vegetables, and fruit crops. They're right alongside the river on the other side of the Colorado River Indian tribes, just north of them. Next slide. In the southeastern, very southeastern corner of our state is the Fort Yuma-Quechan Indian Tribe and the Barred Water District. They each share this small valley on the other side of Yuma, Arizona, right on the river. About half of the acreage is in the Barred unit, about half is in the Indian unit, and the Barred Water District serves and partners with the Fort Yuma-Quechan Indian Tribe to deliver water there as well. Next slide. Then we have the Imperial Irrigation District with 3.1 million acre feet per year of rights to Colorado River water, irrigating roughly half a million acres of forage, vegetable, fruit crops in the Imperial Valley, wedged between Mexico to the south and the Salton Sea just to its north. And the IID conserves and transfers, as Secretary Crowfoot mentioned, 500,000 acre feet of water a year in long-standing durable partnerships with urban water providers in Southern California that have helped to maintain California within its 4.4 million acre foot allocation. Next slide.
500,000 in the 3.1 million?
So that would be 3.1 million. The 500 is deducted from that, so it takes it down to 2.6 million, a little less than that oftentimes of total use on an annual basis. Then we have the Coachella Valley Water District. That's about 330,000 acre feet a year plus some additional transfer water. Half of the valley is urban, so think of Coachella Festival if anyone attended recently. And then the other half of the valley is dates, vegetables, fruit, turf crops there on the north side of the Salton Sea. Next slide. Then we have the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, serving half of California's population, 26 member agencies, base rights to 550,000 acre feet per year, supplemented with up to an additional 590,000 acre feet per year with of supply potential conservation forbearance, fallowing, exchange, and other transfer programs that have been developed over the years. Next slide. So a little bit of background on how California really kickstarted the development of the river and the cooperation of the states to work together. So California was the quickest and one of the fastest developing regions in the early history of the basin, primarily in the Imperial Valley and its growth, and then the growth of the Los Angeles area looking to for additional water supply resources. The other states, being concerned about California's growth over time, wanted to protect their rights. California needing some stable supplies. There was periodic floods that were very devastating that used to flow through Mexico up into the Imperial Valley, and then the need for hydropower. There was a dam that was needed on the lower Colorado River to harness the energy from that water and also to protect communities from those devastating floods. So in 1922, the cornerstone of the Colorado River's management, the Colorado River Compact, was signed by each of the 7 states' representatives. Half of the water allocated for the upper basin states, half of the water for the lower basin states. This was really meant to preserve upper basin future development. They were colder, higher, slower growing. The lower basin states, particularly California and also Mexico as well, that was growing a lot with water at the time, partly from California, allowed the lower basin development to proceed. So California pushed and was successful in obtaining the Boulder Canyon Project Act from Congress in 1928 that ratified the 1922 Compact. It authorized the construction of the Hoover Dam, the Imperial Dam, and the All-American Canal that delivered water directly to the Imperial Valley rather than going through Mexico where it used to go previously. And it apportioned that 7.5 million acre feet from the lower basin states. For California, that was 4.4 million acre feet, 2.8 for Arizona, and 300,000 acre feet for Nevada. The Interior Secretary, Department of Interior, contracted individually with Palo Verde Irrigation District, the Metropolitan Water District, Imperial Irrigation District, and the Coachella Valley Water District for direct deliveries. And California, because other states were concerned about California's growing use of Colorado River water, in exchange to get the Hoover Dam constructed for largely California's benefit, California voluntarily limited its rights in perpetuity to 4.4 million acre feet per year. Next slide. So California's agencies together, the Interior Secretary wanted to make this water available for California as the Hoover Dam was being constructed, but needed to have some certainty and have the agencies work out amongst themselves how that water was going to be divvied up within California. So for California's base apportionment, there was 3.85 million acre feet per year allocated for the largely agricultural districts, and then 550,000 acre feet for the Metropolitan Water District. Beyond that, there was additional water contracted for that later became an issue, which I'll get to in a moment, additional water to Met, San Diego, IID, Coachella, and then the Palo Verde Irrigation District for up to a total of 5.362 million acre feet per year of Colorado River use. Next slide. So in 1944, the United States and Mexico entered into the 1944 treaty that apportioned water in the Rio Grande in Texas, also the Colorado River, and then dealt with a little bit of the Tijuana River as well. That gave Mexico 1.5 million acre feet per year in this binational agreement, and it allows proportional shortage sharing between the United States and Mexico that Mexico has been a very good partner with over the years and developed minutes, which are basically small incremental adjustments or interpretations of the treaty that don't require U.S. Senate approval. And then in 1963, Arizona and California ended their long battle between the two states over some key disputes that the two states had. This was the longest case in the history of the United States Supreme Court, largely over California's opposition to the construction of the Central Arizona Project, this large canal that goes from Lake Havasu up to Phoenix and then Tucson, pulling large amounts of water out of the river. California felt that was going to impair California's rights and further this deficit that existed and was well known at that time on the river, even prior to climate change, intensifying the situation. Also dealt with Gila River issues and how the river was calculated overall and interpretations of the prior appropriation doctrine between states. The Secretary of Interior was required not to deliver outside of entitlements, report regularly, and then also importantly, especially for California, it identified present perfected rights. Those are rights that existed prior to the construction of the Hoover Dam and prior to the Colorado River Compact, and ensured that those were protected, but also importantly, that the rights of American Indians in the lower basin were protected. Those are some of the highest priority water users on the entire basin, are the tribes whose priority date is not based on their use, but based on the creation of the reservation, which makes them some of the highest priority users, both in California and the basin as a whole.
Madam Chair, can I ask a question or two as he goes along, just to see?
Absolutely.
I just don't understand. Could you just repeat? When you said the Secretary can't deliver.
Use the mic if everybody.
I'm sorry. When you say the state, the Secretary cannot deliver to states outside entitlements, what do you mean by outside entitlements?
So there was a dispute at the time, if you saw on that chart, that basically divvied up California's 4.4, but it went beyond that. There were different interpretations at the time. There was an early case called Wyoming versus Colorado, which basically said if you have individual states that have prior appropriation doctrine, basically the first in time, first in right principle, then it also applies between these states themselves. So California's historical interpretation was we've been developing, we've been using this water before other states could. Yes, while there's some idea about splitting the water on an agreement basis between the states, there was this rival interpretation that because California was developing, putting that water to use, making massive investments in development of those water resources, that was really what was critical to that case, is this dispute between California and Arizona, California reliant on the priority system, and the belief that because that water was put to use, developed, the infrastructure developed to be able to put that water to use, whereas it was not in other states, that California should have the right to that water. So the Supreme Court, in that case, on a very split decision that was very consequential, stated that California was limited to that 4.4 million acre feet per year, that because it used in excess of that, it did not have the rights to it. So that has had lingering sort of consequences over time.
So the first in time, first in line was sort of...
Parts preserved, other parts not.
Got it. Thank you.
Next slide. And so in 1968, Arizona being successful in the Arizona versus California case, they developed were looking to develop the Central Arizona Project, delivering water uphill several hundred miles. California, though, stinging from that loss, got into the legislation that in a time of shortage, that the CAP's supply, which was going to further the deficit in lower basin, would be subordinated to all of California's use. Which is an important protection for our state, and also required the Interior Secretary to develop long-range operating criteria, which were baked in 1970 for 8.23 million acre feet of releases from Lake Powell down to Lake Mead, covering the lower basin, 7.5 million acre feet of use, plus half of the Mexican treaty obligation. Next slide. And in 2003, as Secretary Crowfoot noted, California was depending on the surplus water that Arizona was not using historically until the Central Arizona Project was created. So at that time, the Interior Secretary, who was a former governor of Arizona, required California to get back within its 4.4 million acre foot entitlement. That was an 800,000 acre foot reduction, which was a dramatic, steep reduction. It took 5 years to negotiate and 10 years to litigate beyond that to validate the agreement. But in essence, what it does is 3.1 million acre feet are quantified for IID. Previously, it was flexible as much as it was able to use. CVWD at 330,000 acre feet, and then a bevy of individual transfers of between water users on compensated, agreed upon terms and bases. And then also, because of the reduced water use in the Imperial Valley, there was less water being delivered to the Salton Sea as a result, which meant that there was going to be ecological consequences to the sea, the state then assumed the mitigation and restoration funding obligations under the agreement. Next slide. And then sort of in closing here, the basin, moving away from a history of conflict and misunderstandings, has developed an effective way of managing based on voluntary agreements between the 7 states in partnership with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. So in 2001, there were interim surplus guidelines to divvy up the surplus that was at the time. Very quickly, it was realized in 2002 that we went from surplus to one of the worst years of hydrology ever. The states then developed the 2007 interim shortage guidelines, which we operate under today, that expire in 2026. The 07 guidelines were not enough to be able to manage the system, so the 2019 drought contingency plan was adopted as an overlay to ensure that there were additional voluntary reductions that were made between the lower basin states. Mexico was able to contribute on a voluntary basis as well, and the upper basin had provisions to comply with their compact obligations. Next slide. And then last year and this year has been filled with a lot of events. We're even going to be meeting with the lower basin states and Reclamation tomorrow to be able to further our collaborative efforts. Last year we had some really bad hydrology, and if nothing was done, it was realized the system was going to get to dead pool within 2 or 3 years' time, at which point you physically cannot pass water through the dams anymore. So the Reclamation Commissioner asked for 2 to 4 million acre feet of reductions. Fortunately, there was the Inflation Reduction Act passed by Congress last summer that allowed for $4 billion of drought funding, which has been prioritized for Colorado River response. That's been used to help California meet its 400,000 acre foot voluntary effort to be able to kickstart the process. It's also enabled this partnership between the CNRA, between the Bureau of Reclamation, Coachella Valley Water District, the Torres Martinez Indian Tribe, and the Imperial Irrigation District over Salton Sea impact response and additional efforts. So right now, we're engaged in this supplemental environmental impact statement process. The '07 guidelines, which are expiring in 2026, are not enough at that time to manage the system. Reclamation opened up a process to revise the current guidelines. Fortunately, the hydrology has improved significantly recently, so that'll enable us to move forward to 2026 to have a more stable position as we're renegotiating the next set of guidelines in earnest. And then also right now, handling the current SEIS supplemental environmental impact statement process to revise the current guidelines. The lower basin states of Arizona, California, and Nevada, who have historically had different conflicts, are working well together to try and develop at least an interim plan to bridge us over into the future. And then in closing here on the next slide, the basin states are working together to develop this final SEIS, at least in the near term. The demand exceeds supply in the basin. There's no other way around it. The Inflation Reduction Act funding, the hydrology has helped significantly, but ultimately developing the next set of guidelines to operate the Colorado River, we're going to have to tackle the decades of drought deficit that's deeply impacting the river system and the future effects of climate change that are only going to intensify future shortages. So California is working with our in-state stakeholders, basin state tribes, Mexico, the United States, to be able to deal with things in the next short-term basis and in the long term. And with that, that's my last slide there, and thank you for the opportunity.
Mr. Ward?
One good question. When you said that for the IRA to be able to support the 400,000 acre feet of reduction, what did that support manifest in? Was it furrowing land, and how did we achieve 400,000 acre feet off of money?
Right. So Reclamation, once they received that money, the Congress authorized it for 3 categories. There was what we call bucket 1, 2, and 3. So bucket 1 was for near-term conservation that can be generated quickly. So that's things like fallowing, that's efficiency-based improvements, things that can generate water quickly. Then there was bucket 2, which is federal investment in long-term durable projects that can generate long-term conservation benefits that are more than a year or two that can last into the future. And then the third bucket was for drought-related impacts to the environment. So that's been helpful and helped to provide that historic investment in the Salton Sea in partnership with CNRA and the local agencies and tribe.
Is that 400,000 acre feet, is that a sort of one-time occurrence that came because of that infusion of money? Is it going to require additional federal support ongoing to be able to sort of achieve the same targets year over year, or are some of those bucket 2, bucket 3 projects, kind of multi-year in nature?
That's a good question. So the multi-year projects, they'll be able to generate that conservation in the longer term. The issue is that we have this money. We're going to be able to generate water quickly that was meant to help the system from collapsing, which is the situation it was in up until the recent multiple pulses of Pineapple Expresses and so on. And so that's going to help us from now until the end of the current guidelines. Those durable investments will help go beyond that. Right. But certainly in the long term for the next set of guidelines, post-2026, there's going to need to be the use of these monies to be a bridge into the future, but there's likely a need for additional investment to be able to help sustain the either voluntary or mandatory reductions that will have to be had to be able to adjust to the new and present reality in the basin.